Okay, so this is just more of a quick painting tutorial, primarily for dry brushing, but I might go into some other techniques as well. So if you want to dry brush, never done it before, it's really not as hard as you would imagine, and I know there may be some folks that are still struggling with it, but like everything else, it takes a little practice, but I think if you follow what how I describe it or how I try it, you'll probably, hopefully, get some rather immediate success out of it. So what I'm doing here is I'm just going to use this rock as an example. I was going to spray paint it, but I think in the interest of time, it's just faster to use an inexpensive acrylic brush on paint. A thin coat should be fine. We're not going for anything fancy. So let me see if I can open this one. This is an old bottle. Okay, well, here's a surface primer. I don't really want to use that. Yeah, let me see. So while I'm doing all this, probably what you want to do is find yourself an old brush, preferably something that's kind of beat up. I like to use flat brushes. Sometimes filberts are okay. Basically, the difference between just a regular flat brush or square brush is this is a square brush or flat brush. You can get these pretty cheap anywhere, dollar store, a whole bunch of them for not much money. These hog bristle brushes. Now these are synthetic. This one looks like it might be a natural hair brush. It's probably horsehair. These synthetic ones, they're pretty cheap. They take a beating. But hog bristle brushes, think about these, and these are fun for certain things. If you just need a cheap disposable brush, hog bristle is definitely one of the cheapest. Problem with hog bristle brushes is they're so cheap that they tend to do things like this, like fall apart, which, that's an easy fix. But also these hairs are not super tightly bound in with the adhesive into the shaft. So you'll tend to get hairs everywhere, especially on these bigger ones. These are real bad with that. You can see they're just fraying everywhere. But these are great for dry brushing something like terrain. You just have to, and they're really good cheap alternative. You just have to be careful of hairs coming out. If you don't care about hairs in your terrain or your model, then don't use these. So also for dry brushing, and there's two ways you can do this. Dry brushing, for me, I like a kind of a stiff brush, something that's got a little bit of a bounce back to it. Some folks I've seen use the makeup brushes, which tend to be very, very soft. I don't know how many synthetic makeup brushes there are. Probably a lot on the market, but pricey ones tend to go with, sometimes you've got these horsehair brushes like this one. Sometimes you've got camel hair, mink, sable, which is kind of like a mink. And there's other types of hairs that they use for brushes. The reason sable brushes are so expensive and sought after is, first of all, sable. I mean, it's an expensive fur. If you're not into fur, that's something that you don't want to represent or be a part of. Don't buy any natural hair brushes. Horsehair brushes, I think, are safely taken from the horse, but natural hair brushes like sable are expensive because, first of all, it's sable. Second, sable has a very, very awesome consistency like this. It's got a little bit of a bounce. It holds its shape, and it holds a ton of pigment. And you can keep a really nice point on them if you maintain them and clean them. But anyway, that's enough about brushes. This is about dry brushing. But I think it's important to know what kind of brush you're working with. So if you're using a soft brush like this, maybe a stiffer brush is the way to go for you if this isn't working out. And if you're using a stiff brush, you know, maybe for your hand or your technique, you can try a softer one. But I like to use something in the range of about a 1/2 inch to 3/8 of inch size. I forget what the actual sizes this is marked at. This is a number 10, 10 flat. So, and the numbers do mean something. There's 3/0, 2/0, 5/0. The higher the number of zeros you've got, the smaller it is, and then it goes into the whole numbers like this: 6, 5, 7, 8, whatever. So for this one, I'm just going to use this one. It's a kind of an Old Faithful, well beaten, chopped up brush. It's been diced on and stuff. I'm not really worried about hurting it. Yeah, you can also do these little angled brushes. Those are nice. But we'll get into that again later. So first, let me just put some paint on this. Yeah, I guess we'll just use this one. The reason I'm using black, it can be any color. If you got a dark gray, that works too. Doesn't even have to be a, I'm just thinking of, you know, use something simple. You just want to get in there. Also, if you like painting rocks, or you want to use rocks for terrain, or if it's some, even if it's a piece of something that you picked up, never hurts to wash it first, because whatever debris or oils are on that plastic or rock or piece of wood or anything else you're using, that stuff's going to fight the paint for adhesion. Same thing goes if you want to glue things to it. So giving it a nice little warm bath in some soapy water never hurts. Not to mention all the bacteria you're probably taking off of there, especially if it's something you found on the side of the road or the street. Let's give a little bit of moisture to this so we can go quicker. And that's mainly because you don't know where this stuff's been. Somebody could have spit on it, dogs could have peed on it, birds could have pooped on it. Everything that collects on your roof when it rains gets washed off onto the street and onto these rocks. Everything you step on is going to end up on these rocks, or anything else you pick up from the road. So just my personal recommendation on hygiene and cleanliness. If you found it on the road, probably ought to wash it. So you can see this is almost turning into a wash. I probably have a little bit too much water on it, but that's okay. It's not going to hurt. This is just getting into the recesses. For dry brushing, you're focusing on the raised surfaces. So if it's not a completely flat covered, I mean, it depends on what kind of look you're going for. But if you just want to show the texture after you put a base coat on it, you're just going to go with a lighter color over this. And black also doesn't always mean black. There are different shades of black you can use. Blue, black, red base. I mean, the black could have other, paint companies like to be clever and add different pigments. This one in particular is just a Vallejo surface primer, usually for airbrush, so you're welcome, because it's a little pricey for the bottle compared to like the cheap craft paints, which I probably ought to use. That's kind of why I'm thinning it down a little bit, but sorry if the camera's banging around. I'm trying to keep this in shot for you. Okay. So once I've got this kind of coated pretty decent, like I said, doesn't have to be perfect. What you're doing with dry brushing is you're highlighting the raised surface of the object. You're trying to pick up all those little nooks and crannies and textures. So whatever dark paint is in those recesses will not be covered up. They'll be kind of accented, framed, if you will, by the lighter color that you've dry brushed on top. So we'll just let that dry over there for a little bit. And I got some wood over here. I scored it with a few little lines, which you probably can't see on camera, which is fine. This side, yeah, here we go. Maybe you can. There's some little bitty lines I just kind of scored in there with some a pair of scissors, and you'll see those, if all goes well, kind of pop up a little bit. Wood grain's kind of funny. So the thing about wood, when you're painting wood, especially softer woods like this is popsicle stick. It's probably birch or poplar, something like that. Could be something even cheaper like basswood. They usually use a lot of the softer woods for this. They don't use like real high grade furniture wood for like oak or something, or ebony for popsicle sticks. But the reason it's good to know what kind of wood you're painting on is because of the density of the cells in the wood, the wood grain. The denser it is, the more resistant it's going to be to absorbing your paint. If you're using a really soft wood like this one is, and the same thing goes for cardboard and things like that. And if any of you caught my texts and the chats on live streams, and I've probably mentioned this a few times, is boards and anything that's soft is going to absorb paint like crazy. And you think you've painted it a real nice flat finish, and then you come back to it and it looks fuzzy or kind of weird. And the reason for that is especially with cardboard. With cardboard, if the top layer is real thin, it'll even warp. It'll look kind of gray instead of solid black. But with wood, all of that soft wood grain is absorbing the moisture from the paint that you're putting on, and it's swelling like a sponge. And what that does is, even on a really smooth piece of wood, once it's swelled up like that, and you can try it on a cutting board and see for yourself, it's going to create these raised edges on that wood, which for dry brushing might be the thing you're looking for. So if you're looking at how this wood is, like really up close, let's say with a microscope, the wood isn't completely flat on the surface. It really looks kind of like something like this. And when you're putting that layer of paint on top, it's kind of fill in these little cracks. And that's kind of what you want, because you want the, if it's a super thin flat surface like plastic or a very polished metal, that paint has nothing to adhere to. And that's why you typically want to scuff it up a little bit. Even if it's not super scuffed up, I mean, like doesn't have to be a fine grain sandpaper or even a real thick grain. I mean, just as long as it's got some texture to it, something for the paint to sink into. If it's got what they call a little bit of tooth. The problem is with wood, and let's say this is the little plank of wood, is when that moisture gets soaked into there, it starts soaking into those grains, it's going to want to do this. It's going to want to expand those grains out because it's swelling up with the moisture from that paint. And so after you paint it, you think it's a nice flat smooth piece of wood, and then you go to try to use it and it's all filled up with that rough, it's got almost like a fuzzy texture to it, if you can feel it on your fingertips. So the paint's still on there, it's still black, but you end up with something like this, which, if that's not what you're going for, you know, you can fix that with a good primer coat. sanding it down a few times and just building up the layers of primer. And after you've done that, sprayed that primer on, what you'll end up with is this kind of nice flat coat that you've sanded and primed and sanded and primed. Same thing goes for plastics and things like that. I mean, if you guys have worked on models before, those of you who have worked on a lot of models, you probably have come across that. So, rock's not completely dry because it's not a really absorbent surface. So, I'm depending on the ambient temperature of the room to help dry this. But you'll notice that the stick almost, it doesn't look quite dry, but you can start seeing the little grains of the texture in the wood showing up really well, where you can kind of just make them out here. Those grains represent harder sections of the wood. So anytime you see a wood grain, it's a change in the density of that wood, where the hard grain and the softer grain kind of meet up. But yeah, so this is touch dry. This one, you can still see it's wet in some spots, but pretty dry. I think it's dry enough for dry brushing. We're not adding any moisture. So yeah, I mean, this is good to go. We can dry brush this. So again, what I did here is I didn't even have to paint it solid black. I really just kind of put a wash on it. I think that's going to be sufficient for a good dry brush coat. So I'll do it two kind of ways. First way I'm going to do it is just straight white. And then the next way I'll do it after that is I'll use a little bit of like black to mix in. We'll do like gradients, like just different shades of black, white, and so forth. Let me see a little napkin over here. So this brush I just used is pretty wet. It's crappy, my little crappy brush. And you can see where I'm still pulling paint off of it. That's okay. Just wipe as much as you can off. I always recommend just wiping on something kind of absorbent that helps take the paint off. I mean, you can do it on this tin foil I've got here, but I think it helps to soak up some of the paint off the brush if you use something absorbent. That's just my experience. Yours may vary. Feels pretty dry. Feels pretty dry. All right. So one of the tricks I mentioned to somebody was using your fingerprints as a guide. You can kind of see the grooves in my fingerprints here. All right. And you don't have to paint your fingerprints black, but if you, let me see if I can focus, you can see kind of the ridges of my fingerprints. I'm just going to take a little bit of white, and don't need a ton of paint. That's more than enough, probably too much even. And I'm just going to take a little piece of cardboard here. Right, so there's your paint. And if you can see the paint in globs, you've got too much. Just get as much of it off the paintbrush as you can. If it's at this level, right here, that's how much paint you want coming off the brush. Just like that. So let's try brush the fingertip first. We'll do a little fingertip test. And you don't want to press. You're just letting the brush do all the work. I'm just very, very gently, just like if you were petting a butterfly's wing. Oops. See, I put too much pressure on, but let's zoom in on that. You can start to see my fingers are getting lighter and lighter and lighter. And those fingerprints, those ridges are catching some of that paint. Hopefully you don't want to get it in the recesses. There you go. So I'd say that's about perfect for dry brushing. So now we got our rock. Ooh, lots of nooks and crannies in there. So what I'm gonna do is I don't want to put the brush straight down. I don't want to do it flat. You don't want to stipple it on because you don't want to put pressure on the brush to release a bunch of paint at once. You're just kind of holding it at an angle and you're just very gently dragging it across. And if you're not seeing any paint coming off, you can put a little more pressure on it. See how I'm getting those edges right there? Very, very, very gently. If you're doing right along the edges, you're going to tend to get a lot more paint off because you're kind of scraping the paint off the brush. But when you want to go over here and pick up some of these more gentle little areas, like I said, you're just very, 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 very delicately just pulling the paintbrush across the surface and letting the paint grab onto whatever it grabs. There's probably a little more technique with this. Different types of paints are going to react differently. I've found that a lot of the cheaper paints that don't have a lot of carrier for the pigment to rest in aren't that great for dry brushing, believe it or not, because the whole point of those is to stay wet and keep that pigment vibrant. And what you want, I mean, believe it or not, cheap paints, they don't really hold the pigment and they dry pretty quick. You don't have a lot of working time, so they're almost perfect for dry brushing. So I'm putting on and I haven't added any more paint to this. I'm just layering and layering and layering. I'm just adding more and more strokes to pick up some of this stuff. You want to see a curve right there. See this little line right in here? Not on top, but this little line right above the top. You can start picking up subtle curves where the light hits it and highlight those, and it kind of gives it that effect. So you can pick up that angle or that edge a lot better. And again, I'm not jabbing it in. I'm just very slowly stroking it across. Not to get too Bob Ross on you, but yeah, little butterfly wings. That's all you're doing. You're just petting the little butterfly. You don't want to crush the butterfly. Kill butterfly. No. So yeah. So now I went from this, right, to that. So plain old rock with a little bit of black wash on it to a very moon-like surface with lots of little craters on it. It's kind of cool. I mean, looks like you've got a piece of the moon with a bunch of, meteors and stuff on it. Here's the black one. Okay, well, and this will happen to you too, but life happens. I got kind of interrupted there for a second, so let me start off where I'm at. I was going to point out another thing too. If you got some cheap cardboard laying around, another easy way to test if your dry brush is ready for dry brushing. Just get some cardboard. You can see the corrugated stuff. Large flat surfaces. There you go. So, oh yeah, that's another thing I'm probably going to cover with you guys a little bit. Now, you can use dry brushing on a completely flat surface that doesn't have, presumably, any texture at all. You can, the reason for that is you can just basically create some texture. So here's what I would assume is the equivalent of a poofy makeup brush. Again, I'm not a super fan of these for dry brushing. You don't have as much control. But if you're just covering a large area, like a big chunk of terrain, yeah, these are great. I wouldn't personally use them on a miniature, unless you just don't care and you just want to get kind of like a general, wipe on it. So let me paint some of this stuff on here. I mean, just by painting the base coat on, you're applying texture. Yeah, we can use this. Why not? All right. What is this one? Oh yeah, okay. So, I'm not going to scratch these up. I'm just going to hit them with some primer coat real quick. And you'll have to forgive my voice. Got real bad allergies today. Okay, we'll let those dry. We'll come back to them later. All right, where were we? So we had the moon rock that was originally this color. We were going to go into this sort of darker area, try the same thing. Looks like a lot of paint left on that. Let's try this. If it looks like it's not pulling paint off, you're good. Believe me. Okay, so let's get in closer with this one. A little bit more light in here. Okay. So we're going to try to paint this little area right here. Just going to very lightly dry brush it over. Almost immediately starts looking different. Now, you notice it almost stands out more than this side did. Okay, just as was like this, ended up looking like that. See the lines and veins, and now we've got this. The reason for that is because of the contrast on the white over the black. It's a much darker base, so you're going to have a lot more contrast when you put it on there. So that's something to keep in mind. Again, darker the base coat, the more contrast you're going to have when you apply a lighter color over it. And that's why you don't always want to go this route. You don't want everything. That was the other thing. So you're dry brushing along. Everything's going hunky-dory. I think on vehicles, you have to watch out for this. Large objects, even small miniatures. With terrain, it's not so much a big deal. But there's your texture, right? What happens is this. If you let the paint get too dry, and this is especially true of the cheap paints, you end up with little bits of dust. We'll call it brush dandruff. You see that? You see what I'm doing here? This is not a problem you can solve with Head & Shoulders or some other dandruff shampoo. Zelsun Blue has nothing on this. This is paintbrush dandruff. So if you've let your paint get that dry, you've got a problem. And here's the reason why. Like I said, on terrain, that's not much of an issue. But when you're talking about a tiny miniature where the head is the size, the face is the size of the space between my fingers, that dandruff looks like giant flakes of ash. And it will make your figure look immediately like a crusty stone. Hey, if that's a look you're going for, boom, you solved it. You got what you're looking for. However, and this goes again with vehicles, if you do this to vehicles, it's going to make your vehicles, your robots, your other machinery look extremely dusty. And if you're just trying to pick out some small highlights, and you're not using vehicles, or you're not in a desert setting or a snow setting, and that's not a look you're going for, watch out that this doesn't get too dry. And you can see how damaged this brush is looking after this. But yeah, it's just something to keep an eye out for. But yeah, if you're doing dust, hell yeah, I mean, you can even make it look as dry as you want. Some of it'll come off, some of it won't. See, it's literally just dust. Okay, so we don't want this one to get too dusty. Let's move on to our wood plank. Like I said, you know, it's not going to kill the brush if there's a little moisture on it. You just want to get it to where it's not seeping wet or sopping wet. All right. I mean, you can feel by touch. If it feels just pretty dry, especially at the edges, you're probably okay. You just don't want it to be wet. Or you can just change brushes, you know, that's even easier. Just means you're damaging more brushes. So let's show you the difference between what this brush does and what this brush is doing on that wood plank. Again, lots of paint, not a lot of paint. Not very much control, a lot more control. So smaller the brush, the more control you've got. That's good. So too much paint, when you're only seeing the rough edges, I mean, you might want to lay down more. I like to start off with very light progressive layers personally, instead of just trying to highlight everything real fast. So let's do this side with the little brush, and we'll do this side with the big brush. Some of that dandruff going on here. Brush dandruff. So if you'll note, I'm not picking up any wood grain. There just isn't a lot of wood grain on here to pick up, but I am getting some texture. And if somebody gets in, some of it gets into the cracks, I mean, you know, so what? No big deal. You're going for kind of a, I mean, this would be a good way to make asphalt, if you wanted to make asphalt for a street. And I'm attacking it a little bit. And I said don't do this, but I'm just doing it because it's a good way to get dusty texture on there quick. And this is really dry. Really, really dry. So, let's see something. Black, not black. Black, not black. See that? Okay. All right, now let's try the big boofy brush that some people like to use. That's cool, that's cool. For certain things it might be useful. So, got a little paint. You don't need a lot. Again, the thing about these brushes is they're made to be used with, at least this, if it's a makeup brush, it's used with a dust kind of application. So you really don't want to get a bunch of paint in these. They're big and thick and puffy like that because the little particles of dust will catch in between the individual hairs a lot better and release as you're letting it go. It'll, just like I showed you with the dandruff, they'll spray off and release on whatever you're putting it on. So you never want to sop too much paint on this. You don't want to soak this thing. You just barely want to get any paint on the edge and just brush it off as quick as you can. You don't want this to be soaked unless you just want to blob paint everywhere. So here we go. We're going to try it with this one. Like I said, this is kind of like a, I'm doing quick, not too aggressive, but kind of aggressive strokes here. Because that's the way this brush is made. You can blush out stuff. And if you're not getting something like this, you got way too much paint on it. So I'm literally just dusting this on. Like I said, I know it seems like this will cover a lot more surface area a lot faster, but in my personal experience, that's not the case. What these are good for isn't to cover a large surface area fast. What these are good for is to really hit the application of the paint once this is dried enough for dry brushing, and get a very subtle blush of paint on it. Like just a whisper of it. I mean, you saw me. I was attacking this thing pretty hard, and this has still got a lot more contrast than this does. And it's got paint on it. I mean, it's there. So if you just want a subtle like hint of another color, and again, it's super important. The amount of paint you put on these brushes is probably the most crucial thing. And it's going to depend on what kind of brush it is. So like I said, if you're just starting out, this is your kind of your first time, you want to dry brush something, and I think Andy said this on his stream too, is just stick with a basic flat brush. You don't need anything fancy, just a little cruddy flat, something you don't mind abusing. All right, so that's that one. So we've dry brushed the rock on the kind of a mild surface saturation, like just a little bit of a wash. We did a little bit darker flat background. Yeah. And you can keep building up on this. You can add color if you want. I mean, let's say you want to give it kind of an icy look, you know, do something like this. Oops. Shake your paints, folks. Shake your paints. You don't want to mess up that carrier pigment or carrier liquid. This is stuff that holds the pigment. I just wasted a ton of it. So, yeah. Shake your paints. Which, I don't know, you could actually use that to rejuvenate some paint that maybe is getting a little too dry for you. So, we're going for the icy look, right? A little more white. And I'm not super concerned about getting this like all one color, you know, or a perfect color. You want a little deviation in it. All right, so this is how you do a frosty blue highlight. And it's really going to pick up a lot where the white's already laid down, because it's going to be darker in those areas, or in the areas where the white isn't, and lighter where the background of the white is. So you'll really see that blue pop. And again, I'm just brushing it across. Now, if I continue, it might be pretty good. Maybe not as poppy as the other one. I mean, it's a pretty light blue, so it might work just as well. So there you go. Frozen tundra, ice rock, or whatever, you know, gray. Like I said, this could be red stone if you want to put red in it. You could make it into granite or some other material. If you really want to go crazy, you can put little veins of other colors in there. And I did something like that with this. This is just literally a piece of foam cut into a jagged shape, and put some cuts in, painted it with some black texture, and just highlighted the edges with a little bit of white. So it looks like some kind of ore is in it. Yeah, just foam, nothing special, not even a rock. Let's see how this blue looks over here. It's kind of drying out, but might be a good, I'm pushing kind of hard because there's really not a lot of paint left. Might be a good effect for shingles, you know? If you like that spruce blue shingle look. All right, so flat surface people, the ones that don't care about painting on little miniatures. You just want to know what it's going to look like on a robot or a vehicle or some kind of house or spaceship. Let's take a look at that. Don't know if this paint is super dry. You know, it's dry enough, but as you can see, it's kind of smooth. This looks like it's got a very, very subtle surface on it. There's some raised letters. Those are going to pop out. Sometimes you don't even want to hit the whole thing with a dry brushing technique. You just want to get the edges. Like, let's say I only want to get the edges. I don't want to get the whole thing and make it look dusty. Again, I'm just using a crappy brush. You can use a much nicer one. That's fine. If you use a nicer brush, you'll probably get more control because this has frayed edges everywhere. It's going to be a little more controllable. Well, let's say I just want to pick up some of these edges and highlight those and not much else. So here again, I'm probably got a little bit too much paint on here. If you're going for a rust effect, this might be something, you know. What I like to do is put a little more highlight on the corners where they meet. Like this one right here, to kind of accentuate that edge. This is not painted, and this looks painted, so. So I'm literally just rubbing it along the sharp edge with this brush, just to kind of pick up that fine line, and then I'm going to put a little bit more emphasis on that corner. And then here I just want to, let's say I want those letters to stand out, but I don't want to paint the whole thing all dusty, right? Well, they stand out a little bit. And this can be good too if you really want to paint the letters later. Or something else, because it'll highlight where they are. It'll be a lot easier for you to see. And that little paint ridge, even though it's super teeny tiny, actually makes a kind of a little dam around the edge of that shape that helps keep that paint from spilling over. So it actually makes it easier for you to fill that in if you're using a very small amount of paint. So there's just edge highlighting. I'm not dry brushing the whole thing. And there's some basic texture or detail highlighting using dry brushing. Flat surface. This one's already pretty dry and very smooth. You can see there's little specks of the paint. I mean, this is a little piece of tin. It's probably got oils and stuff in it. I think it's probably like some instant muffins, or I don't know what they were, but if you just want to give it a little dusting, what I would recommend is don't use strokes that are always in the same direction with something like this, because it just looks a lot more worn and naturally weathered unless it's something you want to emphasize directional wear, like on an old vehicle or spaceship where it's, you know, getting a lot of burns from the front. So here I'm just putting little scratches and nicks in it. Let's see if I can. You can kind of see it a little bit. I think if you want to do rust is tricky. Rust is weird. You can do that with dry brushing. There's other ways to do it too. Chipping, things like that. I know Terrain by Aaron's got this really cool technique of he does like scratches and smears with a paint pen, which I would never be able to do that. Or I don't know, maybe I could, but I just I would have never thought of that for sure. It's pretty cool. He literally will draw a little dab, a line, and before it dries, he just smears it in the direction he wants it to go, and it's effective. I mean, looks like something hit that metal and took the paint off. So let's do some silver, and then I think we'll wrap this up. And I'm hoping that, you know, some of this is coming across. I don't want to really go too quick. I do want, you know, whoever's watching this to kind of learn a little bit of technique for this kind of stuff. I'm not going to claim to be an expert. Sorry, I had the brush in my mouth. But I've been doing it a while, and you know, if you like the way I paint, then you're basically I'm just telling you how I do it. Other people might do it a little differently, but I think in general this is pretty much the understood way to. Don't even need a lot. So sometimes I'll put some white under the silver to make it stand out more, because it's silver's such a weird color, and it depends on what paint type you're using. Like I said, really old paints and practice paints are great for this. I'll just put little metal highlights on there. How much you want to do, I mean, that's up to you. If you think it needs more, put more on it. You think it needs less, stop. But what I would recommend is always start small with very tiny amounts. And what I'm doing here is I'm trying to make this look like a worn piece of metal. And I'm actually even just kind of randomly adding this little texture scratches. Some of this isn't even silver, it's probably white. But yeah, that silver will come through. And if you don't see it at first, as you start painting the rest of the object with similar colors, it'll start to bring out some of the stuff you painted before. You know, if this doesn't look silver right away, you paint something dark next to it, and then another object that's got that same silver highlighting or texture, and suddenly this will kind of tie into it, and it won't look as white. I mean, by itself, this could probably just pass as white. But if you look at it at a different angle, different lighting, let's say if I turn off this light, and I just use this light, right? Not as harsh. Sorry about that. You start to see some of that metallic pop through. Yeah. Quality monitor helps with color, by the way. Yeah. If you're using an old computer monitor, the color may not be as exact as you think it is. So using two monitors, they might have two different color shades or tones based on what, you know, that monitor is capable of. But yeah, I think that kind of does the job. For rust, again, this is kind of my technique. What I like to do is I like to build up. So I might build up with something like this, like a dark brick red or barn red, blood, like a sort of a brownish red. I'll mix this with a little black, because, you know, by itself it's probably too dry. I mean, too red. And for that, you can use this crappy brush. Crappy brushes are great for this stuff. So now I've got this kind of deep blackish reddish brown. And what I like to do is where I want a little bit of rust, if it's on the edges, I'll put it on the edges. If it's something I want to extend out to the middle, I'll just start randomly dabbing it in. You don't want the rust to look too intentional. You want it to look kind of chaotic, like it was a natural thing. There are very few natural occurrences, even on man-made objects, that are going to look angular or, let's say, engineered. So you don't want to do that. So that's my little base coat. I might put a little heavier coat on it. Really good place to apply rust spots if you make a lot of mistakes, like I will often do, especially with robots that I'm trying to build way faster than I should be attempting, is blobs of glue are fantastic areas to make your mistakes look intentional. Because you can just say, well, that's just some bubbling rust. It's just some rust that's coming up over it's tearing up that metal surface and causing it to oxidize. So once you get into that domain, then I would say if you want to make it even a little more intense and a little bit more obvious, I mean, you could stop right there with the rust effect. And I think that would be sufficient. I think people would register that as rust. Or you can go really crazy and add a little bit of red. I mean orange. And I'm just gonna dab this very, very lightly. Not a dry brushing technique. This is more like just a dab. So I'm just trying to. You can dry brush it like this with different layers. Because I'm creating some contrast by adding that red. And I don't want to completely cover up the dark stuff. I'm just kind of accentuating the degree of rust it has. You can make it as subtle or pronounced as you want. Keep adding more as you go along. Deviate a little bit, put some dots in some other places. So there you go, reddish brown and some orange, and it will make you some tasty little rust spots. This is pretty subtle. If I were to, I would probably go a little bit further than even this. I mean, if you want to really go crazy, you can dry brush it on a little bit just to kind of give it some surface rust areas. But yeah, this is like your basic kind of grimy surface rust. There you go. All right, last but not least, I think that covers all the dry brushing and the rusty techniques. Chipping, I mean, there's a ton of different ways to do that. You can physically abuse it. You can rub some sandpaper or even your fingernails on it. I don't really like that. It's kind of hard to control. Sometimes steel wool, if you're creating like a surface texture, you could maybe cut a little notch in here and create like another edge, like it got cut. This is already, I can feel a texture on it to the touch. But I think we'll save that for another video. But I hope this has helped some of you guys with who are having some trouble with dry brushing and other techniques related to that. Applying metal, applying rust, highlighting stuff. It's not the only technique out there to highlight detail. There are lots of ways to do it. Dry brushing is just one of many tools in your painting arsenal. As any painting video will probably tell you, that's got more viewers than mine. Yeah, you know, good stuff, fun. I think that covers most of your areas. All right, guys, like and subscribe. You got any questions about this video or any of the things I did in it? If there's anything I said, if I went too fast, if you have any comments about it, let me know. I'm always happy to answer questions. I mean, this is one of my favorite things to do is, you know, paint stuff, texture stuff. You can get crazy with faux textures too. Don't even get me started. Faux wood. Their entire careers built around just making fake painted objects. Yeah. All right. Have a good one. Talk to you later. Like and subscribe.